Hello, Mary. Your first story. It's called The Landlady. Roald Dahl, The Great Automatic Grammatizer, and Other Stories. The Landlady. Billy Weaver had travelled down from London on the slow afternoon train with a change at Swindon on the way, and by the time he got to Bath it was about 9 o'clock in the evening and the moon was coming up out of a clear, starry sky over the houses opposite the station entrance. But the air was deadly cold and the wind was like a flat blade of ice on his cheeks. Excuse me, is there a fairly cheap hotel not too far from here? Try the Bell and Dragon, the porter answered. I might take you in. It's about a quarter of a mile along the other side of the road. Billy thanked him, picked up his suitcase, and set out to walk the quarter mile. The Bell and Dragon. He'd never been to Bath before. He didn't know anyone who lived there, but Mr. Greenslade at the head office in London had told him it was a splendid city. Find your own lodgings, he'd said, and then go along and report to the branch manager as soon as you get yourself started. Billy was 17 years old. He was wearing a brand new navy blue overcoat, a new brown trilby hat, a new brown suit, and he was feeling fine. He walked briskly down the street. He was trying to do everything briskly these days. Briskness, he had decided, was one of the most common characteristics of all successful businessmen. The big shots at the head office were absolutely fantastically brisk all the time. They were amazing. There were no shops in this wide street that he was walking along, only a line of tall houses on each side, all of them identical. They had porches and pillars and 4 or 5 steps going up to the front doors, and it was obvious that once upon a time they had been very swanky residences. But now, even in the darkness, he could see that the paint was peeling from the woodwork on the doors and windows, that the handsome white facades were cracked and blotchy from neglect. Suddenly, in a downstairs window that was brilliantly illuminated by a street lamp not 6 yards away, Billy caught sight of a printed notice propped up against the glass in one of the upper panes. It said bed and breakfast. There was a vase of pussy willows, tall and elegantly beautiful, standing just underneath the notice. He stopped walking. He moved a bit closer. Green curtain, some sort of velvety material was hanging on either side of the window, and the pussy willows looked wonderful beside them. He went right up, peered through the glass into the room, and the first thing he saw was a bright fire burning in the hearth. On the carpet in front of the fire, a pretty little dachshund was curled up asleep with its nose tucked into its belly. The room itself, as far as he could see in the half-darkness, was filled with pleasant furniture, with big, comfy, plump armchairs and a big sofa, a baby grand piano. And in one corner he spotted a large parrot in a cage. Animals were usually a good sign in a place like this, Billy told himself, and all in all, it looked to him as though it would be a perfectly decent house to stay in. Certainly it'd be more comfortable than the Bell and the Dragon. On the other hand, a pub would be more congenial than a boarding house. There would be beer and darts of the evening, lots of people to talk to, probably be a good bit cheaper too. He'd stayed a couple of nights in a pub once before and he'd liked it. He'd never stayed in a boarding house, and to be perfectly honest, he was a tiny bit frightened of them. The name itself conjured up images of watery cabbage and spacious landladies and a powerful smell of kippers in the living room. After dithering about like this for a couple, 2, 3 minutes in the cold, Billy decided that he'd walk and take a look at the Bell and Dragon before making up his mind. He turned to go, and then a very queer thing happened to him. He was in the act of stepping back and turning away from the window when all at once his eye was caught and held in the most peculiar manner by the small notice that was there. Bed and breakfast. Bed and breakfast. Bed and breakfast. Each word was like a large black eye staring at him through the glass, holding him, compelling him, forcing him to stay where he was and not walk away from the house. And the next thing he knew, he was actually moving across from the window to the front door, climbing the steps that led to it and reaching for the bell. He pressed the bell. Far away in a back room, he heard it ringing, and then at once, it must have been at once, because he hadn't even had time to take his finger from the bell button, the door swung open, and a woman was standing there. Normally, you ring a bell and you have to wait at least half a minute before the door opens, but this dame was like a jack in the box. He pressed the bell, she popped out, made him jump. She was about 50 years old, and the moment she saw him, she gave him a warm, welcoming smile. "Please come in," she said pleasantly. She stepped aside, holding the wide door open, and Billy found himself automatically starting into the house. The compulsion, or more accurately, the desire to follow after into that house was extraordinarily strong. "I saw a notice in the window," he said, holding himself back. "Yes, I know. I was wondering about a room." "It's all ready for you, my dear." She had a round, pink face, very gentle blue eyes. "I was on my way to the Bell and Dragon," Billy told her, "but the notice in your window just happened to catch my eye." "Oh, my dear boy, why don't you come in out of cold?" "How much do you charge?" "5 and 6pence a night, including breakfast." It was fantastically cheap. It was less than half of what he'd been willing to pay. "If that's too much, then perhaps I can reduce it just a tiny bit. Do you desire an egg in the morning? Eggs are expensive at the moment, but I'll give it you 6pence less without an egg." "5 and 6pence is fine. I should like very much to stay here." "I knew you would do. Come in." She seemed terribly nice. She looked exactly like the mother of one of his best friends from school. Billy took off his hat, stepped over the threshold. "Now just hang in here. Let me help you with your coat." There was no other hats or coats in the hall. There was no umbrellas, no walking sticks, nothing. "We have it all to ourselves," she said, smiling at him over her shoulder as she led the way upstairs. "You see, it's not often I have the pleasure of a visitor into my little nest." The old girl was slightly dotty, Billy told himself, but 5 and 6pence a night, who gave a damn about that? "I thought you'd be swamped with applicants," he said politely. "Oh, I am, my dear, I am, of course I am. But the trouble is, I'm inclined to be a teeny weeny bit choosy and particular, if you know what I mean." "Oh, yes. But I'm always ready. Everything's always ready, day and night in this house, just on the off chance that an acceptable young gentleman will come along." And it's such a pleasure, my dear, such a great pleasure, that now and again I open that door and I see someone standing in there who is exactly right. She was halfway up the stairs. She paused with one hand on the stair rail, turning her head and smiling down at him with pale lips. Like you, she added, and her blue eyes travelled slowly all the way down the length of Billy's body to his feet and then up again. On the first floor landing, she said to him, "This floor is mine." They climbed up a second flight, "And this is all yours. Here's your room. Oh, I do hope you like it." She took him into a small but charming front room, switched on the light as she went in. The morning sun comes right in the windows. "It is Mr. Perkins, is it?" "No, it's Mr. Weaver." "Mr. Weaver, how nice. I've put a hot water bottle between the sheets to air 'em out, Mr. Weaver. Oh, it's such a comfort to have a hot water bottle in a strange bed with clean sheets, don't you agree? And you may light a gas fire at any time if you feel chilly." Thanks very much." He noticed that the bedspread had been taken off the bed and the bedclothes had been neatly turned back on one side, all ready for someone to get in. "I'm so glad you appeared. I was beginning to get worried." It's all right," Billy answered brightly. "You mustn't worry about me." "And what about supper, my dear? Did you manage to get anything to eat before you came?" "Oh, I'm not a bit hungry, thanks. I think I'll just go to my room as soon as possible, because tomorrow I've got to get up real early and report to the office." "Very well then. I'll leave you now so you can unpack. But before we go to bed, would you be kind enough to pop into the sitting room on the ground floor and sign a book? Everyone has to do that, because it's a law of the land, and we don't want going breaking laws at this stage in the proceedings, do we?" She gave him a little wave and went quickly out the room and closed the door. Now, the fact that his landlady appeared to be slightly off her rocker didn't worry Billy at the least. After all, she's not harmless, there was no question about that. She was also quite obviously a very kind and generous soul. He guessed that she'd probably lost a son in the war or something like that. Never got over it. So, a few minutes later, after unpacking his suitcase and washing his hands, he trotted downstairs to the ground floor and entered the living room. The landlady wasn't there, but the fire was glowing in the hearth. The little dachshund was still sleeping in front of it. The room was wonderfully warm and cosy. "I'm a lucky fellow," he thought, rubbing his hands. "It's a bit of all right." He found the guest book lying open on the piano. He took out the pen and wrote down his name and address. There were only 2 other entries above his name, and as one always does goes down the guest books, he started to read them. One was a Christopher Mulholland from Cardiff, the other Gregory Temple from Bristol. "That's funny," he thought. "Christopher Mulholland, that rings a bell. Now, where on earth had he heard that rather unusual name before? Was he a boy at school? No. Was he one of his sister's numerous young men? Perhaps a friend of his father's? No, it wasn't one of those. He glanced down the book. Christopher Mulholland, 231 Cathedral Road, Cardiff. Gregory W. Temple, 27 Sycamore Drive, Bristol. As a matter of fact, now I came to think of it, he wasn't all that sure the second name didn't have almost as much of a familiar ring about it as the first. Gregory Temple, he said aloud, searching his memory. Christopher Mulholland. Oh, such charming boys. a voice behind him answered, and he turned, and he saw his landlady sailing into the room with a large silver tea tray in her hands. She was holding it well out in front of her, rather high up, as though the tray were a pair of reins on a frisky horse. "They sound somehow familiar," he said. "They do? How interesting. I'm almost positive I've heard those names before. Isn't that queer? Maybe it was in the newspaper." They weren't famous, were they? Were they? I mean, famous cricketers, footballers, something like that? Famous, she said. "Oh no, I don't think they were famous. They were extraordinarily handsome, both of them. I can promise you that. They were tall and young and handsome, my dear, just exactly like you." Once more, Billy glanced down at the book. "Look, this last entry's over 2 years old." "Oh, is it?" "Yeah. Christopher Mulholland is nearly a year before that, more than 3 years ago." "Oh, dear me, I'd never have thought it. How time does fly, doesn't it, Mr. Wilkins?" "Miss Weaver," Billy said. Weaver. "Of course it is. How silly. I apologise. In one ear, out the other. That's me, Mr. Weaver. You know something that's really quite extraordinary about all this." "No, dear, I don't." "You see, both these names, Holland and Temple, I not only seem to remember each of them separately, so to speak, but somehow or other in a particular way, they're connected or something. I thought they were both famous for the same sort of thing. I thought they were both, see what I mean? Like Dempsey and Tunney, for example, Churchill and Roosevelt." "How amusing. Now, come over here now, my dear. Come and sit down beside me on the sofa. I'll give you a nice cup of tea and a ginger biscuit before you go to bed." "Really, you shouldn't, Papa," Billy said. "I didn't mean to do anything like that." He stood up by the piano, watching her as she fussed about with the cups and the saucers. He noticed she had small, white, quickly moving hands with red fingernails. "I'm almost positive it was in the newspapers I saw them. I'll think on it a second. I'm sure I'll remember it." There is nothing more tantalising than a thing like this, which lingers just outside the borders of one's memory. He hated to give it up. "Now, wait a minute, Mulholland, Christopher. Wasn't that the name of the Eton schoolboy who was on a walking tour when all of a sudden—" "Milk? Sugar?" "Yes, please. And then all of a sudden, Eton schoolboy. Oh no, it can't possibly be right. My Mr. Holland was certainly not an Eton schoolboy when he came to me. He was a Cambridge undergraduate. Came over here now. Come over here now. Sit with me and warm yourself in front of a lovely fire. Now, your tea's all ready for you." She patted the empty space beside her on the sofa, and she sat there smiling at Billy and waiting for him to come over. "There we are. How nice and cosy this is, isn't it?" Billy started sipping the tea. She did the same. For a minute or so neither of them spoke, but Billy knew that she was looking at him. Her body was half turned toward him, and he could feel her eyes resting on his face, watching him over the rim of the teacup. Now and again he caught a whiff of a peculiar smell. It seemed to emanate directly from her person. It wasn't unpleasant, but it reminded him. I wasn't sure what it reminded him of. Pickled walnuts? Leather? Was it the corridors of a hospital? Mr. Mulholland was a great one for his tea. Never in my life have I seen anyone drink as much tea as dear sweet Mr. Mulholland. I suppose he left fairly recently, Billy said. He was still puzzling in his head about the two names. He was positive now that he'd seen them in the newspapers, in the headlines. Left? Oh dear boy, he never left. He's still here. Mr. Temple's also here on the third floor, both of them together. Billy set down his cup slowly on the table and stared at his landlady. She smiled back, and then she put out one of her white hands and patted him comfortingly on the knee. How old are you, my dear? 17. 17? Oh, that's the perfect age. Mr. Mulholland was 17, but I think he was a trifle short than you are. In fact, I'm sure he was, and his teeth weren't quite so right. You have the most beautiful teeth, Mr. Weaver. Do you know that? Not as good as they look. They've got simply masses of fillings in them at the back. Mr. Temple, of course, a little older. He was actually 28, and yet I never would have guessed it if he hadn't told me. Never in my whole life. There wasn't a blemish on his body. A what? His skin was just like a baby's. There was a pause. Billy picked up his teacup and took another sip of tea, and then he set it down again, gently in the saucer. He waited for her to say something else, but he seemed to have lapsed into another one of her silences. He sat there staring straight ahead of him into the far corner of the room, biting his lower lip. That parrot, he said at last. You know something? It had me completely fooled when I first looked through that window. I could have sworn it was alive. Oh, that's no longer. It's most terribly clever the way it's been done. It doesn't look in the least bit dead. Who did it? I did. You did? Of course. And have you met my little Basil as well? She nodded towards the dachshund, curled up so comfortably in front of the fire. Billy looked at her, and suddenly he realized that this animal had all the time just been as silent and motionless as the parrot. He put out a hand and touched it gently on the top of its back. The back was hard and cold, and when he pushed the hair to one side with his fingers, he could see the skin underneath, greyish black and dry and perfectly preserved. Good gracious me! How absolutely fascinating! He turned away from the dog and stared with deep admiration at the little woman beside him on the sofa. It must be awfully difficult to do something like that. Not in the least. I stuff all my little pets when they pass away. Have another cup of tea? No, thanks, Willie said. And then he realised that the tea tasted faintly of bitter almonds, and he didn't much care for it. Now, you did sign the little book, didn't you? Yes. Oh, that's good. Because later on, if I happen to forget what you're called, then I can always come down here and look it up. I still do that most every day with Mr. Holland and Mr. Temple, Gregory Temple. Excuse my asking, but haven't there been any other guests here except them in the last 2 or 3 years? Holding her teacup high in one hand, inclining her head slightly to the left, she looked up at him out of the corner of her eyes and gave him another gentle little smile. No, my dear, only you. Oh no.